Hey everyone! Today, let's dive into the interesting world of the Franciscans, a unique group within the Catholic Church that's been around since the early 13th century. Now, the Franciscans aren't just one single group, but actually a collection of different orders. They were founded by St. Francis of Assisi back in 1209, a man who was so dedicated to living simply and humbly that he gave up all his wealth to follow a path of true poverty. Francis inspired many others to do the same, creating orders for men, women, and even lay people who wanted to live in his spirit of simplicity. Originally, Francis started preaching around 207 and decided to go straight to the top, to Rome, to get the Pope's blessing for his new way of life. Pope Innocent III was in charge then, and in 1209 he gave Francis the green light to form his order. The Franciscan rule was all about a life free of possessions. These early Franciscans literally depended on begging for their food, aiming to live like Jesus and his disciples. They traveled, preaching in streets and towns, living simply and spreading their message to everyday people. Under Francis's guidance, another influential figure emerged, Clare of Assisi. She started a branch specifically for women, called the Poor Clares, bringing women into this movement. As time went on, that extreme poverty rule was slightly relaxed. It became a bit of a balancing act, with some Franciscans wanting to stick to a stricter, original version of the rules and others adjusting to make it a little easier. This actually caused some friction within the group, and eventually the Franciscans split into several branches. Today, there are three main orders for the Friars: the Observants, who are usually what people think of as Franciscans, the Capuchins, with their distinctive habits and known for their simplicity, and the Conventuals, or Minorites, who are often seen wearing gray habits. Francis was really clear about his vision for this group. The name, Friars Minor, or Lesser Brothers, wasn't just a label, it was a statement. He wanted his followers to embrace humility, reject wealth, and live in solidarity with the poor. Even the simple tunics they wore were a direct symbol of this humility. It was all about stepping away from the comforts and status of wealthy society and getting closer to the hardships that many people faced daily. Those who followed Francis became this order of Friars Minor, what we often call the first order of the Franciscans today. Now, these groups have their own unique identities but share a common spirit, following the rule of St. Francis, focused on humility, service, and preaching. There's also a second order, specifically for women, which started with Clare of Assisi. These sisters became known as the Poor Clares, dedicating their lives to a similar path of poverty and prayer. And then there's the third order, made up of people who wanted to bring the Franciscan spirit into their everyday lives without living in religious communities. This third order is actually split into two: the secular Franciscans, who live as laypeople, and the third order regular, who live in communities with traditional vows. Francis' influence spread quickly, and he gained followers like Bernard of Quintaval, who left everything behind to join him. These early Franciscans lived in humble places, even setting up in an abandoned leper colony at one point. They were known for their cheerful spirit, traveling through the hills of Umbria, singing and preaching to anyone who would listen. As Francis entered his last years, he found himself grappling with major changes in the order he had founded. The Brotherhood, originally a simple group bound by a desire to live humbly, was becoming more structured and centralized under church oversight. Struggling with the demands of leading a growing and sometimes divided order, Francis turned to Pope Honorius III in 1219, requesting assistance. In response, the Pope appointed Cardinal Ugolino as the order's protector. This was a significant shift, and soon after, Francis decided to step away from handling the day-to-day operations. He focused on guiding the spiritual direction of the order, drafting a new rule in 1221 and refining it again in 1223 for official approval. From that point, Brother Elias of Cortona, a capable but sometimes controversial figure, took over as the practical leader of the order. He managed daily matters and, after Francis's passing, even became the Friars' official leader in 1232. However, his style was divisive. He was known for his strict leadership and sometimes heavy-handed decisions. It was Elias who oversaw the planning and construction of the Basilica of San Francesco in Assisi, where Francis was later entombed. This grand building remains a significant spiritual center for the Franciscans today. While the Friars' missions expanded into new regions, including Germany and England, debates arose over the strict interpretation of poverty, a core Franciscan value. Some friars like Matthew of Narni and Gregory of Naples pushed for stricter rules on fasting and accepting alms, which strayed from the original guidelines Francis had laid out. Francis tried to rein in this shift, but the changes continued, especially with Elias advocating for a more established presence in society, which he believed would support the order's growth. Francis's closest supporters, known as the Observants or Zelanti, opposed these relaxed approaches, insisting on remaining true to the founder's original intent. Francis had always envisioned a path for the Franciscans that embraced humility and rejected wealth, so when Elias began gathering funds for the construction of the Basilica in Assisi, many of Francis's followers felt it went against their ideals. Brother Leo, one of Francis's closest companions, was a vocal critic of these changes. He even went as far as breaking a collection box Elias had set up to gather donations for the Basilica. The resulting tension led to Leo's punishment and only further fueled the conflict between those who favored strict poverty and those who were more flexible. After Francis passed, debates about poverty continued within the order, creating friction over how the Franciscans should grow and operate. By 1309, this conflict reached a breaking point, leading to Elias's removal from leadership. The next few leaders worked to balance strict ideals with practical adjustments, trying to keep the order united while also respecting Francis's original vision. This struggle between strict adherence to poverty and the need for adaptation lasted for many years, deeply influencing the Franciscan order's evolution. And under Pope Clement V, the Franciscan order experienced a tug-of-war between two opposing groups, the stricter spirituals, who believed in absolute poverty, and the more moderate conventuals, who were open to a less severe interpretation. In 1309, Clement set up a council in Avignon to try to reconcile these groups. Ubertino of Casale, a leading figure among the spirituals, was a member of this council and managed to influence its decisions. As a result, the Council of Vienne largely supported the spirituals' approach to poverty, and Clement issued a papal decree, Exevi de Paradiso, in 1313 that leaned in their favor. But things shifted under Clement's successor, Pope John XXII, who came down on the side of the conventuals. In his bull Quorundam Exigit, he relaxed some of the strict poverty rules set by Exevi de Paradiso and ordered the spirituals to comply. The spirituals, emboldened by support from figures like Michael of Cesena, resisted this new direction, refusing to accept what they saw as a betrayal of their values. Some even questioned the Pope's authority to change the rule. John XXII responded harshly, summoning 64 of these dissenters to Avignon, handing over the most unyielding to the Inquisition, and eventually burning 4 of them at the stake in 1318. Around this time, the Pope also shut down all of the observantist houses, the homes of those clinging to the stricter lifestyle. The debate around poverty resurfaced a few years later, but with a new twist. Pope Nicholas III's 1270 bull, Exiit qui Seminat, had reaffirmed that all Franciscan property technically belonged to the Holy See, with the friars allowed only to use it. This arrangement was meant to keep the Franciscans focused on their vow of poverty, and Nicholas III even declared that renouncing ownership of all possessions was holy and following in Christ's footsteps. However, Nicholas III's order prohibited anyone from questioning its validity. Despite that restriction, bitter arguments about the interpretation of Franciscan poverty continued to surface. The spirituals believed that Christ and the apostles owned absolutely nothing and clung to Exiit qui Seminat as validation. But Pope John XXII, determined to curtail what he saw as the spirituals' extremism, issued a bull in 1317 condemning one of their groups, the Fraticelli, and in 1322 removed the ban on discussing exeat qui seminat. He then brought in experts to analyze the doctrine of poverty. These experts couldn't agree on every detail, but most argued that the idea of absolute poverty contradicted the Church's right to hold property. The Franciscans held a chapter in Perugia that same year and proclaimed their belief that Christ and the apostles owned nothing as both true and Catholic. John the 22nd, however, would have none of it. In his 1322 bull ad Candidarum Canonum, he refused to take on ownership of the Franciscans' property and ordered them to accept at least some possessions, effectively ending the order's claim to absolute poverty. Then, in 1323, he issued Cum inter nunnios, declaring it heretical to believe Christ and the apostles held no possessions at all. Outraged Franciscans, including General Minister Michael of Cesena, philosopher William of Ockham, and others, publicly voiced their protests. Michael of Cesena refused to back down, and in 1324, even Louis the Bavarian sided with the spirituals, accusing the Pope of heresy. John the 22nd responded with yet another bull, Quia Quorundam, asserting that there was no contradiction between the apostolic way of life and communal possessions. In 1328, Michael of Cesena was summoned to Avignon, where he was imprisoned along with others who resisted the Pope's stance. Meanwhile, Louis the Bavarian, defying the Pope's authority, marched into Rome and crowned himself emperor. He then declared John the 22nd deposed and appointed a spiritual Franciscan as anti-pope, Pietro Reinogixi. Despite the bold defiance, the movement began to fracture. Most of the Franciscan order eventually submitted to Pope John the 22nd. At a chapter held in Paris in 1329, the majority of Franciscan houses affirmed their allegiance to the Pope. Over time, even key figures like the anti-Pope Nicholas V and Michael of Cesena eventually gave in, with William of Ockham also submitting shortly before his death. And in the 14th century, disagreements within the Franciscan order led to the formation of several distinct groups and even smaller factions, each with its own vision of how strictly the Franciscan rule should be followed. These groups were almost like sects, differing not only in practice but sometimes in philosophy. Among them, the Clarini, or Clarinini, were a notable example. Founded by Angelo de Clarino around 1350 on the banks of the Clarino River in Italy, this group adhered to a hermitic lifestyle. Like many other smaller congregations, they eventually had to merge with the larger observant faction in 1568, as ordered by Pope Pius V. Another splinter group, the Minorites of Narbonne, formed in southwestern France after 1300 by followers of Peter Olivi. They were accused of aligning with the controversial Beguards, a group labeled heretical, and ultimately faced suppression by the Inquisition under Pope John the 22nd. Then there was the reform led by Johannes de Valibus in 1334 at a hermitage in Brugliano, near Foligno. Though it was suppressed by the Franciscan leadership in 1354, it re-emerged under Paolo de Trinci in 1368, receiving official recognition from Pope Gregory XI. This congregation grew significantly, spreading across Italy, France, Spain, and Hungary. By the 15th century, it was known simply as the Brothers of the Regular Observance and gained considerable papal favor due to its strong opposition to the Fraticelli, another heretical group. The observant faction eventually comprised almost half of the Franciscan order's houses by the late Middle Ages, largely due to figures like Bernardino of Siena, Giovanni da Capistrano, and Dietrich Kolde, who championed the reform movement. The observance influence sparked attempts at reform within the conventual branch as well. Various subgroups of reformers emerged, each with their own unique approaches and leaders. From Boniface de Sava in France and Germany to the Spanish reformer Philip de Berbigel, whose followers emphasized the wearing of a distinctive small hood. Other groups, like the Neutri, tried to bridge the gap between the observants and conventuals, but were ultimately forced to affiliate with one or the other under papal pressure. Further, the Amadeists, founded by the Portuguese noble Amadeo, gathered a small following with their strict principles before dissolving after his death in 1482. Despite various attempts at reunification, the rift between the conventuals and the observants remained. Several popes and church councils sought to mend this division. Pope Martin V commissioned John of Capistrano to draft a set of statutes aimed at bringing the two sides together, and these were adopted at a general chapter in Assisi in 1430. However, resistance from conventual houses left this attempt ineffective. Subsequent efforts by Pope Eugene IV and even the Franciscan Pope Sixtus IV similarly failed. Ultimately, in 1517, Pope Leo X formally sanctioned the split. The conventuals were allowed a more lenient approach to property and income, while the observants continued to uphold a stricter adherence to the vow of poverty. Around this time, the Franciscan order became more closely tied to the Inquisition. By 1203, Pope Gregory IX had appointed Franciscans and Dominicans as official inquisitors. Franciscans, long involved in combating heresy, now held significant authority to prosecute heretics, with Pope Innocent IV officially approving the use of torture for confessions in 1252. Tragically, some friars, particularly among the spiritual Franciscans, found themselves under Inquisition scrutiny for their own views and practices. Figures like Angelo de Clareno and Bernard Delisio faced interrogation, and some observants were even executed during periods of internal suppression. The Franciscan role in the Inquisition expanded dramatically over the centuries, impacting various groups across Europe and beyond. This intense approach toward enforcing orthodoxy extended overseas with the Age of Discovery. In Spain, approximately 300,000 Jews were forced to convert, flee, or face execution under the Spanish Inquisition. As the Spanish Empire expanded, the Inquisition followed, bringing its methods to the Americas. The Franciscan missionary efforts in the New World began in earnest in 1523 when 3 Flemish friars, including Pedro de Gante, arrived in what is now Mexico. Although 2 of them died while traveling with Hernán Cortés to Central America, Pedro de Gante established an influential mission, immersing himself in the local Nahuatl language and working closely with the children of indigenous elites. The arrival of another group of 12 Franciscan friars in 1524, led by Martín de Valencia, further cemented the Franciscans' role in New Spain. They established the Convento Grande de San Francisco, which would serve as the center of Franciscan activity in the region for the next 3 centuries, marking the beginning of a significant and often complex legacy in the Americas.